I'm Cindy Wheeler, and I'm co-chair of 285 All, a community organization that monitors issues along Highway 285 that affect the 23 communities along that highway. I want to describe the new mission that the Department of Energy has planned to create for WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. When I learned about this new mission, I realized it created an unacceptable risk for my neighborhood. And so who else knew? Was I the last to hear about this? So first I asked my neighbors. They didn't know. Actually, they thought they did because they confused the new mission with the old mission. And one of the hardest things that I've had to do is to convince people that this is a brand new mission. Then I asked my state rep and state senator, two longtime political leaders. It was news to them. Our three county commissioners, the ones that I've spoken with, did not know about it. The staffer of our congressional delegation in Washington, D.C., my representative, had never heard of this. And in fact, the Radioactive and Hazardous Materials Committee of the state legislature that we presented to were shocked. The worst, though, was finding out that even the Santa Fe County Fire Department Emergency Response Team leader didn't know about this. And of course, that's the agency that will be required to determine if an accident has occurred and mitigate it. So that's when I decided it wasn't my neighborhood that's at risk. It's hundreds of thousands of neighborhoods at risk because this mission will cross at least 11 states. So why does no one know? Why is it such a secret? Well, it's because the DOE, the Department of Energy, and NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, don't want the public to know. They refuse to speak to the public about what they're doing because they hope to have the program in place before the public realizes the risks. It's among the creepiest interactions I've ever had with a bureaucracy. In an administrative hearing recently, an Orwellian hearing, the Department of Energy even convinced the New Mexico Environment Department to issue a gag order from anyone using the words WIPP expansion, which was the topic of the hearing. So this presentation has three parts. It'll go pretty fast. And the first part is me describing what WIPP is. And even if you know what it is, it's kind of important to define it so that we can compare it to what the second part of my presentation is, which is what the DOE wants WIPP to become. And in that part, I'll also talk about how we know what this new mission is and what concerns us about it. And then we'll talk about strategies for what we can do if you think this is an unnecessary risk to your community. So the purpose of this is to make sure that every community that would be affected by this new mission is aware of the risks, and also to point out how the Department of Energy is violating state and federal law by trying to change WIPP's mission. The monitoring organizations are the ones that I'm using primarily are the ones that you see on the screen. They are the kind of people who go home on a Friday afternoon and read the Federal Register, something most of us don't do. But I have this slide up because I want you to understand that all the data that I'm going to talk about comes from government sources, unless otherwise noted. Okay, this map just points out where WIPP is located in New Mexico. And the reason I show it, although many people know where it is so that I can distinguish it from these other facilities that are also nuclear facilities in that part of the state. Some of them actually exist. Some of them are being planned, and they're very important issues, very important facilities, and have big consequences. But for this particular presentation, I want you to just forget about the other issues and realize that we're only talking about WIPP. So what was WIPP and what is WIPP? It's the only operating underground nuclear repository in the nation, and it's only authorized to take nuclear weapons waste. So no waste from commercial nuclear power plants. New Mexico negotiated limits for WIPP when it was being created in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And the reason for that is because New Mexico knew it was just a little tiny state with not very much power, and that it was negotiating this at the request of the federal government to use its state, one of them with the federal government of one of the most powerful nation, the most powerful country in the world. And so it set up these 4 important limits. The first one is that WIPP is a pilot plant only. So it's in the name. It's supposed to be one of many around the country that the Congress promised to build. It's designed to be an experiment, a pilot plant, and it was never meant to be the only one, making New Mexico bear the sole burden of disposing of all of the nation's nuclear weapons waste. The Department of Energy and Congress have built no other plants or repositories around the country. The second limit is WIPP's volume. It is limited down to the cubic foot, the amount of waste that it's authorized to take. And so what you see here is a schematic of WIPP with the buildings on the surface, the 4 shafts that go down carrying material, personnel, waste, 2,000 some feet into the salt beds, and down into these panels. Inside the panels are rooms, and that's where the waste is emplaced. This is the size that WIPP is authorized to be. The third limit is the permit that has WIPP close in 25 years. That means it's supposed to stop taking waste in 2024. And this is a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act permit. And finally, the fourth limit is that WIPP can only take a certain kind and form of waste. You hear it called transuranic or true waste. The important thing for us is that it is man-made and it's radioactive. And for WIPP, it's mostly the element plutonium-239. So WIPP is allowed to take the type of waste that you see in these X-rayed drums. It is waste that's been contaminated by plutonium during the process of nuclear weapons production. So protective clothing, tools, sludge. It is not allowed to take pure concentrated plutonium like the metallic plutonium that you would find in this plutonium pit. Plutonium pits are the triggers that are used to set off atomic bombs. These limits are encoded into legally binding permits and laws and agreements, and they are still in place. And that's what it's important for people to realize. And so the federal government can't just change or ignore these laws without first changing the laws legally or administratively. The names of these laws are right here. But what's important is for us to realize that New Mexico put these into place so that the federal government would not start to overreach like it's doing right now. Very briefly, shipments that go into WIPP come from military installations and labs all across the country, and they go to Los Alamos. At Los Alamos labs, they're packaged, and then from there, they travel the designated radioactive waste route, primarily, not entirely, all the way down to WIPP for emplacement. What happens at LANL is that LANL packages the waste. So the waste is put into these 55-gallon barrel drums. They are then collected together and put into a TruePacked container, which insulates the contents from things that might occur during a traffic accident or something on the road. And then these true packed containers are put on a trailer and they're trucked to WIPP. And that's WIPP. That's WIPP until the DOE decided to change its mission. Remember, those rules and laws are still in place. How do we know that the Department of Energy is trying to expand WIPP, even though it's being so quiet and secretive about it? You just need to look at the public record. So first of all, in December of 2020, the Department of Energy published a notice of intent to write an environmental impact statement in order to expand WIPP's mission. It stated that it wanted to bring surplus plutonium to WIPP, and it wanted to expand it. The surplus plutonium amounts to about 48 metric tons of this surplus plutonium. And so that's the notice of intent. Then, around the same time, the National Academies of Sciences wrote a 200-some-page report where they also explain this new mission, and they try to fill in some of the gaps so that they can describe the details of what would have to happen for this mission to be expanded. There's also a report from the Government Accountability Office that discusses this issue. So this is the context of the big picture. We absolutely know that this WIPP expansion of the mission is planned. We know some of the details from the National Academies of Sciences report. We know that they're planning on bringing surplus plutonium to WIPP, and we also know that this is not a waste that was ever planned for WIPP. And then that leads us to our concerns. So concern one is the increased volume. What you see here in blue is the volume of WIPP right now. It's the same image that I showed you before, but it's slightly tilted. And this is the amount of waste that WIPP is allowed to take. What they want to do is expand it, and that's the green that you see here. If they do, it will make the volume of WIPP more than twice the size that it currently is. And that leads us to concern number two, which is you can see that there's no way they could build out this infrastructure and then emplace it with waste in the next 2 years. Indeed, now the Department of Energy is saying that, it will be emplacing waste until 2080. And then they said, no, I don't think we can hold ourselves to that date. And that's why we're now saying that they will keep accepting waste for the rest of the century. Concern three is the distance. So most of this waste is at a plant in Amarillo, Texas called Pantex, but it can't go directly to WIPP because it's not in the form that WIPP is allowed or authorized to accept. So Pantex first, the plan is to truck this waste to Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico. From there to carry it across Interstate 40, across all these states, all the way to South Carolina for more processing, and then carry it again along Interstate 20 for final displacement at WIPP. That's a 3,300-mile road trip for every package and shipment of this waste. Concern four is that the waste will be different. It will no longer just be plutonium contaminated items, but it will be solid metallic plutonium that's found in these decommissioned triggers for nuclear bombs. So a plutonium pit like this is not entirely made of plutonium. It has a certain section of it that has solid metallic concentrated plutonium, and that's what we're talking about. So in this form, this solid metallic form, the plutonium will be taken from Pantex across the panhandle of Texas, and then from there it will travel along Interstate 40 until it gets to Klein's Corners in New Mexico, and then it will go up the designated route for radioactive waste to Los Alamos. It will pass this area twice, coming and going. And in order to understand that, you need to know what happens to the waste in Los Alamos. So in Los Alamos, or LANL, the waste is turned into an oxidized plutonium, a fine silty powder like this. And then this fine silty powder, once again, has to travel the exact same route, putting all of these communities again at risk. Communities along 502, all of these communities that have built up around 599, the communities that Interstate 25 skirts Santa Fe along the southern border, and then down 285 past 23 other communities. And this is while the plutonium is now not only in a different type, but a different form, and the most dangerous form of plutonium in the case of a release. As it leaves Los Alamos, some important places that it passes are actually 5 pueblos. I have 4 of them marked here. They're farming pueblos primarily. So we have Santa Clara Pueblo, we have San Ildefonso, we have Poaki and Nambe, which I omitted and I apologize, and then Tesuque. And then from there, it continues on down until it gets to Santa Fe. Of course, in Santa Fe, I showed the communities that it skirts. And then it goes once again down to Klein's Corners and across Interstate 40. From Santa Rosa to Tucumcari, all of this area is very productive farmland. And then across more farmland, back to Pantex, and I'll show you what happens from there. So on a map of the United States, this is what the route looks like. First, the waste goes from Pantex to LANL, then from LANL all the way across these communities and states to South Carolina. From South Carolina, and this pink is across Interstate 40. From South Carolina, it takes Interstate 20 all the way to WIPP. That's at least 11 states that it's passing through, and that it's providing a risk for to all the communities along that route. Now, this part of the route, the orange part, is the only part where it will be traveling in those true packed trucks. For more than half of the trip, it's going to be traveling in a different kind of vehicle. And that's concern number 5. This type of transport vehicle is with the Office of Secure Transportation. They are really semi-tractor trailer trucks that look like any other. This is an actual picture of one of the Office of Secure Transportation's trucks. They are somewhat reinforced against terrorist attack, and they are accompanied by armed federal agents. These actually have a mission right now, and their mission is carrying nuclear weapons across the country. However, recently, the Los Angeles Times wrote a study and a report on this agency, calling it troubled. The report says that there is a high driver turnover, that the trucks are old, and that there is not proper money for maintenance to keep them up. And there's very poor worker morale. So you can see that if this agency is struggling with the workload that it has now, and then you double the workload by increasing, putting a whole nother mission on it, it will really struggle. Indeed, one high-level Energy Department official is quoted in this article as saying, if you are in one of the communities along the route, you have something to worry about. Concern 6 is property loss. Sandia National Labs wrote a site remediation study claiming that particulate plutonium, that's the kind we're talking about, that's powdered here, is almost impossible to clean up. So if it is released over land, and we're talking about our farms and our ranches, the topsoil will have to be scraped. If it's released where there are buildings and structures, now we're talking about our homes, our schools, our businesses. Essentially, they will have to be abandoned because they can't be cleaned up properly from this kind of powdered plutonium oxide. Concern 7 is health and cancer. In this form, this is the most dangerous form of plutonium if it's released. So in a release, these particles are very quickly carried on breezes and winds, and they're inhaled by anyone who's in the area. They get inhaled, but they don't get exhaled because the particles are then lodged and trapped in lung tissue. This is a particle of plutonium that was inhaled and is now lodged in the lung tissue of an animal. Once it's in lung tissue, it now provides a continuous and ongoing source of radiation, and that it doesn't leave the lungs. And that's what causes cancer of the lungs, the bone, and the liver. The Nobel Peace Prize winning organization that I've listed here states that less than 1/1,000,000th of an ounce of particulate plutonium, when inhaled, causes cancer 100% of the time. Now, this might take months to years. If you are 85, that's one thing. But you can see that people at most risk are children because they have that time for those cancers to develop. My concern is even with the very best of emergency response teams, and even in an urban area with a nearby response team center, I don't know how they would get to an area where there was a release, determine if there was a release, and then tell people not to breathe outside. Concern 8 is some packaging. At Lanel, where they package it, this is how they do it. The fine silty powder is put into a metal container, which is then wrapped inside a PVC bag. And from there, it's placed in one of these two types of containers that you see at the bottom. The purpose of the PVC bag is to contain contamination of the plutonium in case it gets out. This is all done inside of a glove box. But what they're finding is that the heat from the radioactive decay of the plutonium inside causes degradation of the plastic bags. And sometimes this degradation is so severe that it actually causes corrosion on the metal containers that hold it. So, what promises has the Department of Energy's planned mission broken with New Mexico that were listed in the first few slides, the limits New Mexico put on the federal government? Every single one of them. No repositories have been built in other states since WIPP, making WIPP the default. The volume will be expanded by more than twice its currently allowed size. WIPP will not close in 2024, but will keep receiving waste for the rest of the century. And the new waste will be a much more dangerous form. Now, no one's saying that you're going to have an accident in your neighborhood in the next 6 months or 5 years or decade. But the point is this: when you increase the volume and the number of shipments over this time frame, the rest of the century, and it's a more dangerous waste in a more dangerous form, with a troubled transport system and problems with the packaging and corrosion, well, we're all adults here, and we know that accidents happen. And if you include all of these factors, you can see that an accident at some point is almost inevitable. And if it happens, the neighborhood it happens to will find that it's an almost catastrophic accident. So New Mexico has the tools to protect its citizens with those agreements that it put into place at WIPP's inception. And we can call on our governor, who is uniquely in a position of power here. She has the ability to block permits and to tell the federal government, no, we have legal agreements in place and you're breaking them. And so the important thing is that we're trying to say the Department of Energy doesn't get to put us at risk quietly, in secret, and in an information blackout. If it's going to try to put us at risk, then it needs to do so openly and in the full light of day.